Hi folks, today we're going to find out what Caroline Ellison has or has not managed to avoid in respect of her plea deal with the US Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. We've managed to get a copy of it, and it goes through everything that she will not be prosecuted for, as well as potential criminal charges that are still on the table. Did she cut a good deal? We'll see. So here we have it. The letter is from the US Department of Justice, Southern District of New York. As you can see, it's addressed to Wilmer Hale. That's Caroline Ellison's legal firm. It won't actually take us too long to go through it. Firstly, the Office of the United States Attorney, we see, will accept a guilty plea from Caroline Ellison. And we know that since this letter, she's actually appeared in court and pleaded guilty to the charges we're about to see. The letter then goes through the various indictments, and I'll run through those quite quickly. In count 1, it is conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and we hear for that she would face 20 years imprisonment, supervised release for 3 years, and fines on top of all of that. Count 2 is for actual wire fraud, and again 20 years plus penalties and fines, and just note here that counts 1 and 2 are for frauds against customers. Again, we have the maximum 20 years prison time, as well as the fines, supervision and other penalties. Counts 3 and 4 are similar stories. 3 is a conspiracy to commit fraud, and 4 is actual fraud, and these two are for frauds against lenders. Again, we have the 20 years maximum prison time, as well as the fines and penalties. Count 5 is a conspiracy to commit commodities fraud, and Count 6 is a conspiracy to commit securities fraud. And both of these have a maximum term of imprisonment of 5 years, plus pecuniary penalties, as well as the supervised release. Count 7 is money laundering with a maximum term of 20 years in prison plus fines, etc. In case you were trying to add it all up, it says here the total maximum sentence of incarceration on counts 1 through 7 of the information is 110 years imprisonment. So that's what Caroline's been busy trying to avoid. Then we find out that the defender, Caroline, shall make restitution in an amount to be specified by the courts. So there are still some pecuniary restitution amounts to be handed down by the court, and the next paragraph says that she will give all the money back that could be traced to the commission of the offences. Now we get to what Caroline has to do before we get to what she will get. And to cut out the jargon, essentially it says she's going to help in any way that she possibly can, and she'll do so truthfully and cooperate fully. So she'll need to provide paperwork, documentation, etc. She'll testify before grand juries, and she'll identify any of the crimes that she may have committed or been involved in or been a subject, target, etc. in respect of, and she will commit to no further crimes whatsoever. So then we get to the first thing that Caroline will still be exposed to. There is no immunity here for any criminal tax violations. Let me read that bit out. Moreover, if the defendant fully complies with your understandings, etc., the defendants will not be further prosecuted criminally by this office for any crimes except for criminal tax violations related to count 1 and 2 of the information counts, 3 and 4 of the information count, 5 of the information count, 6 of the information, and count 7 of the information count. So there you go, that's 7 in total. So that's 110 years got rid of. We get to a piece that's been redacted, and we think it may relate to some further crimes that Caroline may have avoided being charged with in the first place. Obviously, the counts we've just talked about, she'd already been charged with those. The thinking is this is likely redacted to avoid tipping off Sam Bankman-Fried as to what the prosecution are actually investigating. So let's look at this statement. This agreement does not provide any protection against prosecution for crimes except as set forth above. So just remember that we're dealing with the criminal justice system here. There is also the civil justice system. We know separately to this letter that Sam Bankman-Fried, Caroline Ellison's former love interest, has actually been indicted by the SEC and the CFTC. and there are civil cases standing against him. These involve huge numbers, and it would be remarkable if the SEC and the CFTC aren't considering civil cases against Caroline, so she has no immunity to those. In those cases, she wouldn't face any imprisonment time, but she would face fines and penalties and other things that the courts can direct, like being bans on a director or an officer of a company, etc. Here we get to the end of the process where the attorneys are saying if Caroline complies with all of the things within this agreement, then they'll file a motion with the court to sentence Caroline as agreed in the letter. Whilst it's therefore still ultimately the court's sole discretion, at that point it would seem like it would be just a rubber stamp exercise. The deal is quite one-sided in many ways in respect of the prosecution. For example, if the attorneys can say Caroline hasn't been helpful enough, then they can release themselves from the obligations in this letter. Caroline, on the other hand, can't withdraw a guilty plea once she's given it. There is no way back. And relating to this, there is one tactic, if you like, that Caroline can't follow through to get into a favourable position. She can't go into court, for example, several years down the line, only to suddenly say, oh, I'll take my guilty plea back. Look, the statute of limitations has passed for all the prosecutions. That is not a loophole she's going to be allowed. There is no protection against anything she says. It can't be suppressed or withheld at any point. And of course, she's going to be giving the prosecutors the lowdown on pretty much everything and anything that would also implicate herself. And yes, if it came to it, that information can be used against her. While this is all going on, and it could be for some years, depending on how Sam Bankman-Fried and some of the other implicated parties react to criminal prosecutions, she's going to be free out and about with some restrictions. First, there's a $250,000 bail bond, and she'll be restricted to the US continent alone in terms of travel. And I just have to point out the staggering difference between the $250,000 bail bond for her versus the $250 million bond for Sam Bankman-Fried. And what does Caroline have to do? She acknowledges that she's accepted this agreement and decided to plead guilty because she is in fact guilty. This quite lengthy last paragraph is interesting because it's stating that if Caroline is not a citizen of the US, then it's likely she could be removed. In fact, I think it's mandatory she would be removed from the US under these circumstances. And also in connection with this, Caroline won't be able to appeal the conviction on the basis of any adverse immigration status. So I think the reason this whole paragraph about immigration is because a lot of people who've become wealthy in the crypto world have actually left the US and changed citizenship, primarily to avoid tax consequences. Because of the time Caroline spent in the Bahamas, this is probably a real risk that the prosecution has identified, and therefore wanted to cover off this risk in this letter. And here we have the letter signed by Damian Williams, the United States Attorney, and agreed to and consented to by Caroline Ellison. So I think there are a couple of open questions, both which could lead to real jail time for Caroline Ellison. Firstly, what is it exactly that the tax authorities could be going after her for, and what are the real prison time risks for Caroline? Secondly, there's the obvious redacted part of this document, and whilst I believe it's probably immunity for some other things not included in the counts, I believe it's probably been redacted to avoid Sam Bankman-Fried identifying it and being tipped off, as I said earlier. Well, do you think Caroline deserves 110 years off her sentence? I think this is just one part of a much bigger government approach to the whole case that we're not seeing at the moment. Clearly, the prosecution need to act fast enough to get this cooperation in place by Caroline so that they can go after their real target, Sam Bankman-Fried. I'll be sure to keep you updated on events as they arise in this whole saga. Make sure you don't miss out by hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell. This narrator would be truly humbled by your presence on this channel. And that's it from me. Bye for now.